Today in this lecture, I'm going to discuss the different kinds of poverty alleviation programs, particularly the poverty alleviation programs in the pre-liberalization period, as well as poverty alleviation programs in the post-liberalization period. Now, by the 1962, when it was already clear that the poverty alleviation programs linked with the land reforms and the abolition of zamindari was not very much helpful in terms of alleviation of poverty in the large rural sectors of India. As well as in urban India, then there was a new paper which was developed and which was put forward before the fourth plan, and it was a kind of a perspective of development. The paper which was mooted, which was actually placed in the fourth plan, was a perspective on development from 1961 to 76. It's a kind of a 15 years long strategic program. Under that particular paper, which later became a very important factor in dealing with the next 2-3 plans, particularly from the 1960s to the 1970s plans, several poverty alleviation programs were thought about. Now, what were the various poverty alleviation programs that were thought about during this time? One small farmers development agency, which we call as the SFDA. Then the second one was the program for marginal farmers and agricultural laborers, which is MFAL, and then the drought prone area program, DPAP. As well as there was a program regarding the desert prone area program. Now, in all these programs, what was the main constituency that was targeted was that of the agricultural farmers, the marginal farmers, as well as the agricultural landless laborers. Now, by the 1970s, the small farmers and the small farmers development agency and the marginal farmers and agricultural laborers program were a kind of aligned together, and they were like put together in order to get maximum benefits of poverty alleviation programs that should now reach to maximum number of people in the rural area. And there were several projects under these different poverty alleviation programs. Similarly, in the drought prone areas program, it was something around which was more developed in the 1973-74 situation to tackle the drought prone areas in various parts of India. And then we also in India also experienced the desert development program, which was initiated in the 1977-78, whose main objective was checking desertification. So that was another very important program under in the pre-liberalization period. Now, in the fifth 5-year plan, which was from 1974 to 78, it also involved a new scheme, the Minimum Needs Program, the MNP. And along with the Minimum Needs Program, the pre-liberalization period also experienced another poverty alleviation program, which is called the Integrated Rural Development Plan, IRDP, which remained the central pillar of poverty eradication since the 6th 5-year plans from 1980 to 1985. Now, apart from these various different kinds of programs, and crores of rupees were actually spent in these different kinds of poverty alleviation programs. This was mainly targeted in the rural areas because the conventional wisdom in the India's planning among Indian planners were that poverty resides more in the rural areas than in the urban areas. But by the 1990s, when economic reforms started, although economic reforms actually started in late 70s and 80s, but it got more institutionalized from 1991. Now, once the economic reforms started in the 1990s, there was already an agrarian crisis in the rural sector. This agrarian crisis was a result of the withdrawal of subsidies from agriculture by the government. As a result of the subsidies getting withdrawn from agriculture, the cost of production actually rose. Whereas, correspondingly, when the cost of production for the domestic agriculture producers rose, the Indian market was also flooded at the same time by 1990s and early 2000s. Indian market was also flooded by several agricultural commodities coming from outside India. Now, those agriculture commodities which are coming from outside India were actually subsidized, whether it is coming from the advanced capitalist country of the West or some kind of a second world countries, or even a very highly subsidized agricultural sectors in the Southeast Asia. Now, those agriculture commodities are flooding the Indian market, and the Indian peasant has to now compete with those highly subsidized agriculture commodities coming from other countries, from outside India. At the same time, there is an withdrawal of subsidy from the government as far as Indian agriculture is concerned, which made the cost of agriculture production for Indian peasant higher. And there were farmer suicides which happened in the 1990s, not only in some kind of a rice belts like in Andhra Pradesh, but also at the same time you have cash crops, particularly cotton, in the Vidarbha region in Maharashtra. Now, how to then address both farmer suicides and poverty? Now, so far, the Indian planners and Indian government was more interested in alleviating poverty. But by economic reform, when economic reform started by 1990s and early 2000s, you have a new problem of farmer suicides in the rural sector. Now, so there was one problem, one additional problem in apart from the poverty alleviation, which is farmer suicide. Now, because there is an impending agrarian crisis in the agricultural sector in the rural countryside, there were also huge migrations from labor migrations from the rural sector to the urban sector. In other words, there is a corresponding increase of poor people in the urban sector. So previously, the pre-liberalization period, poor people were more residing in the rural areas. Now, with the agrarian crisis from 1990s onwards, there is a huge migration, labor migration from the rural to the urban areas. Now, that is so that makes a new challenge for the India's planners as well as the Indian government to tackle these issues. So you have now a poverty alleviation program not only in the rural countryside but also in the urban sector as well. Now, what were the specific poverty alleviation programs in the post-liberalization period? Now, there were several poverty alleviation programs in the post-liberalization period. One of the very important the first important one was the Swarna Jayanti Gram Swarozgar Yojana. It's a kind of self-employment scheme. It was launched in April 1999. Then you have the Sampurna Gramin Rozgar Yojana launched in September 2001, and it was to ensure additional wage employment along with food security. Because as we mentioned, that there was also an agrarian crisis and there was a lack of accessibility to food items for the poor people. Number 3, it was Pradhan Mantri Gramodaya Yojana launched in 2001 to achieve sustainable human development at villages. Number 4, Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana. Now this started in December 2000 to provide road connectivity in rural areas. So now you have now this fourth program, which was the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana. It is actually an infrastructure building process. You have the rural roads being more now taken care of by the government, so that people from one place to other place can actually move, and they can sell their agriculture products to the market. Number 5 is Antodaya Anna Yojana, which is started in December 2001 for high food subsidy under the targeted public distribution system. Now remember, in the pre-liberalization period, the public distribution system was more of a universal nature. In other words, every citizen of India who had ration cards could have access to public distribution system. But by 1990s, when the government was withdrawing subsidies, then the public distribution system became more targeted, and this Antodaya Anna Yojana was actually a form of a high food subsidy under the targeted public distribution system. Then the sixth one was Annapurna Yojana, which is a totally central government sponsored, and it began in April 2002 for food security for senior citizens under the National Old Age Scheme, National Old Age Pension Scheme. Now this is also very interesting that those who are senior citizens, in other words those who were above 60 years old, they were given this particularly Annapurna Yojana. They were under this purview of the Annapurna Yojana. The seventh one is the Indira Awas Yojana. This was specifically targeted for the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe citizens, as well as free bonded laborers, and those non-scheduled caste and non-scheduled tribes citizens who are below the poverty line. So one is that this entire poverty alleviation program, it is interesting to see now that it is a more targeted it is more targeted kind of a program. It is not a universal anti-poverty program. It is not for all people, all the poor, but it is very much targeted around identitarian as well as class lines. So you have the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes who automatically comes under this Indira Awas Yojana, which is basically for housing projects, but at the same time you have bonded laborers as well as only those non-SC, non-ST or the scheduled caste, scheduled tribe persons who are below the poverty line. Then in the 8th you have Swarna Jayanti Shahari Yojana program, which is for urban self-employment. So remember, as we were talking about, that the number of poor is also now increasing at the urban sector. So the Indian government also had to address this question by specifically introducing certain urban self-employment programs as well. And Swarna Jayanti Shahari Yojana program was precisely to address that question. In 9th, the Valmiki Ambedkar Awas Yojana, that began in December 2001 to ameliorate the living conditions of the slum dwellers. Now this is very interesting that again the slums are very much more often than not are more present in the urban sector than in the rural sector. And Valmiki Ambedkar Awas Yojana, which is for the again a kind of a rural kind of a urban housing plan for the slum dwellers. Then in the 10th, there was National Social Assistance Program launched in 1995 to provide social assistance to poor household affected by old age, death of primary earning member and maternity care. 11th, you have Employment Assurance Scheme started in October 1993 to create wage employment during the lean agricultural period. The lean agricultural period means during that particular time when there is no agricultural production, and during that particular time the wage employment, people are unemployed. So in the October 1993, this particular Employment Assurance Scheme was started by the government to ensure that those who work in the the fields, or those who are dependent in agriculture, they must also get some earning when there is no crops or no kind of crop season during the lean period in agriculture. Jayaprakash Rozgar Guarantee Yojana was also ensured to guarantee employment to the unemployed in the most distressed districts of the country. Now, this is very interesting that how there were also other categories of targeting. So, one category is people below the poverty line. Another category was scheduled caste, scheduled tribe people. Then there were other categories like the old-aged people. But now you have a particular category which is targeted to very distressed districts, very backward districts, for program for the unemployed people. So you have different employment programs now starting. And then the government was changed in 2004, and a new government came in 2004. And one of the first important steps that the important poverty alleviation program in a very macro sense that started with the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act by 2005, which ensured at least 100 days of wage work with the minimum wage in mind in a given state, and that was later named as the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. And it was a kind of a act which was passed in the parliament, so it becomes a kind of an law in the parliament. So the government has to follow that particular act. Now, the Rural Employment Guarantee Act program started first on the 2nd of February 2006 for 200 most backward districts in the country. But later, from 1st April 2008, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act that covered all the districts of India. Then the second important steps that the government the central government took was the passing of the scheduled tribes and other traditional forest dwellers, or in other words, the recognition of Forest Rights Act, which was passed in 18th of December 2006, and it later became a kind of in the name of Forest Rights Act, or the Tribal Rights Act, or the Tribal Bill. And this particular bill was passed by the parliament in order to ensure the rights of the tribals and the Adivasis who are dependent on forests. And this act was needed in order to replace very age-old colonial forest laws. And although this program was not in line with the traditional poverty alleviation program, but the precise scope of this law, which makes the Adivasis a natural right to the forest, those who are dependent on forest itself, is something which benefited the Adivasis to come out of its daily poor existence. Finally, in the National Food Security Act of 2013 was passed, and it precisely aimed to provide subsidized food grains to approximately 2/3 of India's 1.2 billion people. The National Food Security Act in 2013 converts the legal entitlements for existing food security programs of the Government of India. Now, it is again an array of several schemes. One such scheme was the Midday Meal Scheme, the Integrated Child Development Services Scheme, and the Public Distribution System. Now, the Midday Meal Scheme and the Integrated Child Development Services scheme are universal in nature, whereas the PDS, the Public Distribution System, will only reach about 2/3 of the population, which is like 75% in rural areas and 50% in urban areas. Now, under the provisions of the bill, which is the 2003 National Food Security Bill, the beneficiaries of the PDS are entitled to 5 kilograms per person per month of cereals at the following prices: rice at ₹3 per kg, wheat at ₹2 per kg, and coarse grains or millet at ₹1 per kg. Now, we have so far now analyzed several uh, poverty alleviation programs in the pre-liberalization period as well as in the post-liberalization period. Now, if you compare the pre-liberalization with that of the post-liberalization period, then certain economists, particularly a kind of a left of center economists like Utsa Patnaik and Arjun Sen Gupta, they will argue that that if you compare the 1950s to the 1980s, in other words, the pre-liberalization period with that of the post-liberalization period, is characterized by agrarian crisis, a growing inequality, you have unemployment also, and as well as worsening of the living conditions for most of India's people. And for them, the common people has an overlap with certain groups. They are arguing that you have the Dalits, you have the Adivasis, you have the OBCs, and you have the Muslim minorities. These four large groups comprises India's big kind of poor people. So in other words, the poverty among these groups are more than in other groups. So the number of poor people is more among the Dalits, the Adivasis, the lower OBCs, and the India's Muslim minorities. But Indian neoliberalism is also being analyzed by many other economists, someone like Kalyan Sannal or a political scientist like Partha Chatterjee, and they argue that the fundamental logic how Indian neoliberalism works and how the poverty is being reproduced over and over again is because of the logic of the primitive accumulation of capital. Now, what is primitive accumulation of capital? A primitive accumulation of capital is basically expropriating the peasant and expropriating a particular person from his mode of production. So in other words, the peasant is expropriated from its land. So he was previously owning a land, so he had some control over a means of production. He is now expropriated from land. Or if, let's say, some other person who is not, let's say, a peasant, but working in a certain informal sector or in a formal sector, with privatization or with some kind of a labor laws, his job is now hired, so he is now unemployed. So he is also kind of an expropriated from his means of production. So here, Partha Chatterjee and Kalyan Sannal both argue that with introduction of the modern capitalist production, it precisely displaces the primary producers, such as the peasants, artisans, and petty manufacturers, from their means of production. Because these people are displaced from their means of production, they also need to be accommodated in the system. Otherwise, they could become a dangerous classes who might revolt against the state. And that is precisely why Kalyan Sannal and Partha Chatterjee argues that several poverty alleviation programs are actually needed to accommodate these disgruntled poor, comprising of the large section of India's peasantry and petty manufacturers and the informal sector labor force, and they need to be accommodated. Otherwise, since they are unemployed or since they have been already displaced by the emergence of the neoliberal phase of global capitalism, which India has already been a bandwagon state, these set of people needs to be accommodated. So you need poverty alleviation programs in both urban sector as well as in the rural sector, so that these people who are negatively affected they do not become dangerous classes against the state. So this is their kind of an analysis. In conclusion, we can say that according to 2011 census, landless households deriving major part of their income from manual casual labor is as high as 38.32%. On the other hand, a whopping 74.51%, so nearly 75% families in India does not have a member who can earn more than rupees 5,000 per month. Now that's a very dismal situation. After 6 decades of independence and with such a long legacy of anti-poverty and income generation and employment generation programs. Now in the middle of such huge pool of poor people, India's desire to become a superpower in the 21st century would always be encountered with the challenge of poverty alleviation, because even with your 6 decades of several poverty alleviation programs and several employment generation programs and income generation programs, this is the situation that your 75% of India's population family does not have its highest member earning not more than 5,000 rupees. Now, at present, the replacement of the Planning Commission, the age-old Planning Commission, was replaced by a Niti Aayog, which is National Institution for Transforming India. Now, this change happened in 2014 after there is a change in the government, and that actually changed the Planning Commission also. The institution of Planning Commission is no more. Now you have a new institution called the National Institution for Transforming India. Now, this focus could not be shifted from eradicating poverty because the Niti Aayog's program, the focus cannot be shifted from eradicating poverty, because if nearly 75% of India's families do not the highest member of 75% family do not earn more than rupees 5,000, that means that there is still a huge gap between the theoretical promise of crushing poverty and the practical performance and the policy implementation of poverty alleviation programs at the grassroots level. So the Niti Aayog, which is the new avatar of the Planning Commission, has to then address the question of poverty. Now, in this respect, the grand task of Indian policymakers would be to provide the citizens a life without poverty and a life with dignity. The answer lies in the future, but the struggle for poverty alleviation in India must go on. Thank you very much.